Well, when asked by a government spokesperson in response to a call by Southland farmers to make changes to winter grazing rules by the Southland Advisory Group, their response was to Neil Wallace in Farmers Weekly this week is, "We're pleased farmers, farming leaders and others in the group accept that intensive winter grazing practices need to improve, and we are working constructively with them to achieve that." Well, is that really true? Acceptance isn't what is happening in the south, as farmers need certainty on the wording within the freshwater policy and want to be heard on the impractical nature of some of the suggested rules. Joining us now on the Opinion Maker panel for this week's topic about future winter feeding systems is two very active members of the Southland farming community currently lobbying the government for change. Southland Advisory Group member and dairy farmer Paul Turner, and Southland Federated Farmers and Vice President for Federated Farmers and Sheep and Beef Farmer Bernadette Hunt. Thank you so much for both of your time. Important there to note that you're both actively farming as well as taking on this challenge voluntarily. So I appreciate your time to come on and discuss this to both of you. Paul, I might start with you in terms of why you embarked on the role of a Southland Advisory Group to help make these changes in the first place.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, well, I guess it all began last year with a meeting we had with the ministers, where a few of us spoke to the ministers about our concerns with their rules they'd put out. And at the conclusion of that meeting, Minister Parker and O'Connor, they sort of opened the door to us to, well, basically you guys have a crack and come back to us with something. But if you do, we don't just want a one-sided view of it. We want it to be, cross-sector with all the relevant parties involved, and come back to us with something constructive, not just knocking it down. So that's where the group was formed with. So dairy farmer, I'm a dairy farmer. We've got a sheep and beef farmer, Turner Bernadette, who's a farmer representing feds, and then we had industry groups of beef and lamb, DairyNZ. We had fish and game and Environment Southland, and also sitting in on the calls we had MPI and the Ministry for the Environment as well. So we had really good buy-in, and everybody was involved in the conversation all the way through. So most of our meetings were over Zoom. It was an extremely busy time of the year when we did our piece of work through the spring, and so we'd meet generally on at least a weekly basis, and really set our brief about what we wanted to achieve, and we just really got stuck into our work, and we've come up with our recommendations, which 6 or 7 recommendations there, which probably don't look much, but there was a heap of behind the scenes work that went into that, and just fleshing out the issues. And it was really interesting how some, you think there's two clear sides of the fence there, kind of an us and them, if you looked at it from the outside, with sort of the farming type groups on one side and then the sort of environmental types on the other side. But that just wasn't the case. Everybody was there for the same reason. Like, we all want good water quality, right? We all want to be able to swim in our rivers with our kids and do everything we want to do, and obviously continue to run profitable businesses. So the level of common ground was quite astounding, and especially once we were able to frame it up. And I think it was important, having the farmers there, and obviously, and the ones with the scientific sort of background, we could sort of work together on how that different rules would be practical or wouldn't be practical. So it was a good collaborative sort of effort.
So the word constructively actually was true by the sounds of that. So that's actually fantastic to hear. Bernadette, for those who are not familiar with the details of the National Environment Standard for fresh water, why do they not deliver the required quality of regulation to achieve the outcomes?
That's a great question, actually. And the key is that a lot of the rules within the National Environmental Standards aren't focused on that the actual freshwater outcome. They impose restrictions on what you do on your land, which don't necessarily flow on to impacts on freshwater. So, for example, a rule that states what date you need to sow your crops by drives farmers to work towards that date, when actually we should be working towards the right weather conditions and the right ground conditions and those kinds of things. So if we put heavy machinery on a paddock that's waterlogged and wet, it does more damage to the soil, which can result in worse outcomes for water. It might result in a failed crop, which means you then have to go and cultivate it again. So that was a rule that focused on what you do on the land as opposed to focusing on the outcome for water. And the group was very focused on coming up with rules and an approach that was outcomes focused. It was all about the water, not about restricting land use.
And Paul, when it comes to the pugging depth in Southland as a dairy farmer, how practical are they for you in circumstances of adverse weather events?
Yeah, well, just basically absolutely not practical, Sarah. And don't get me wrong, there's various parts of Southland that are better than others, and we're in probably what is considered a drier area of Southland. But there's still, you get an inch of rain overnight, and despite your best attempts, 500 kilo animals are going to push into the surface of the ground. It's just as simple as that. So there was a better way, and Bernadette touched on it before. It was outcomes. Like what is the actual reason for that rule? And quite clearly, we don't want contaminants getting to waterways, right? So that's where we felt the deletion of the pugging rule, along with the sowing date, which Bernadette touched on, and replacing them with a requirement to protect critical source areas, which is where your contaminant's going to get to waterways, was a far more robust approach. And you couldn't sort of muck it up by that approach. Even people not adopting the best practice, as long as they had those critical source areas protected, you're going to have a much better outcome for freshwater health.
Bernadette, I've got here in the executive summary of your recommendations, and the Dairy New Zealand chair has asked the government to at least respond in good faith. That the group has responded, but we've got their 1st of May 2021 deadline looming. Do you strongly believe when they say that they will come out in coming weeks that we will have an outcome in due course very soon?
I'm very hopeful of that. We're hearing some fairly positive messages through, I'm not directly involved in conversations with them in Wellington, but some of our counterparts at Feds are, and some senior people in other organisations are. And the messaging has, the feedback we're getting is that they're being looked on favourably. But as you say, the time is now. The challenge for government is they'll need to put this through cabinet. That a minister can't just sign off on this stuff on his own, because it was a cabinet decision to get it out there originally. So presumably it'll need to be another cabinet decision to change it. And I also know that when we first gave them the recommendations, it was the last sitting week of Parliament before Christmas, and then they're largely not on the job again until the beginning of February. So they haven't actually had a lot of time looking at the work. But to be fair, I kind of think they've had enough now, and they need to hurry up. We need to know what's going on so that people can get on with doing what needs to be done.
What's been your biggest learning, Paul, in as a farmer engaging in a process with government, and a government that has proven to be challenging to deal with in communicating and collaborating with the industry, what the right approach is? Because across farming circles, there's certainly been lots of different levels of approach, and everybody has their own opinion around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Sarah. And I think, we've seen there's a few ginger groups that started up recently, and everyone's entitled to their own thing, and I won't comment on them. But I think the ministers, when we presented our work to them, and we'd given them a couple of updates on the way through when we were doing our piece of work, and we presented before Christmas, they're extremely complimentary about sort of how quickly we'd done the work, but how effective it was, and it was was extremely robust because it was coming from all viewpoints. We had everybody in the same room, and we're very conscious as we were going through each rule we were working on that we had unanimous agreement on all of those things. So essentially, when we provided that advice to government and to their officials, we had Environment Southland ticked off, we had Fish and Game ticked off, the farming groups, we were in favour as well. So everybody was across the line on it. Really, it just it was there for them to pick up and run with, really. So that was, and so the ministers, they were very impressed by that approach, and they said, well, that could be a good way, in the future to address similar situations. Put a small cross-sector working group on it, and I hate that word working group, but essentially what we were, and get it done, just down and dirty, and get stuck into it and churn out a result instead of endless head banging, which is what we see with one side coming up with something, another side knocking it down and just banging away. Whereas get everyone in the same room and get it done and achieve an outcome, it was a lot more successful.
Bernadette, how are Southland farmers feeling, sort of 3 to 5 years on around farm environment plans, critical source areas, and having some form of certainty around what a desired practical farm management solution could be? And I just want to get an understanding of how far attitudes may have changed or not.
Oh, honestly, I think they've changed hugely. I think most farmers in Southland on the whole are ready for a change of this nature, because the vast majority of farmers are doing a good job, and they are so sick of seeing television coverage of people who are letting the rest of us down. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the coverage that happens on TV and print media and that kind of stuff is actually tailored to have an effect, and it's possible to take a bad photo of just about anything if you want to frame it in that way. But there are absolutely a few people who are letting the side down, and while most of us have changed our practice and got ahead of regulation requiring us to do it, there are the slower to change people who need this regulation to make it happen. And so the vast majority of Southland farmers are happy to see that happen. But what got brought in last year, unfortunately, was going to penalise even the top farmers and make life very difficult for even the farmers that were well ahead of the game. And so hopefully our recommendations will be accepted, because we're pretty confident that they'll achieve better results without penalising the people that are already doing the job right.
Thank you so much to both of you in a very busy time, and all the hard work that you've been doing voluntarily on behalf of not only Southland farmers, but the flow-on effect this will have to all farmers across the country. And of course, it's Southland farmers leading the way there, because of course they are affected by their location geographically. There is Southland Advisory Group member Paul Turner, dairy farmer in Southland, as well as sheep and beef farmer Bernadette Hunt, and also Vice President of the Southland Federated Farmers. Absolutely incredible work from both of them. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, nice boots.
Yeah, thanks. They're new.
Ben, you alright?
Oh, yeah, sorry, mate. Just meerkatting pretty hard, eh? Yeah, I just said to myself, Ben, work hard.
You deserve new boots.